Our next speaker is Costas Panayotakis. He's a professor of sociology at the New York City College of Technology, and he's speaking on Europe, Greece, and the return of fascism, some implications of the current crisis.
Hi, I need to stand up. As a teacher, I'm used to standing up when I talk. Yeah, so my talk will try to place the fascist comeback in Greece and elsewhere in the context of, within a broader European context. So the self-understanding of the European Union for a long time has been that the European Union was supposed to bring European countries together, which had, of course, as we all know, a very, centuries-long past of bloody wars, two of which became global wars. And this was supposed to happen by, bringing France and Germany together. That's how, the whole project started in the 50s with an agreement between France and Germany over the sort of exploitation of the sort of resources of coal in the disputed borders between France and Germany that had led to wars between the two countries in the past. So the whole project was supposed to tame Germany, to make sure that Germany would not start any kind of wars, and it was supposed to establish a Europe of prosperity and democracy that would take Europe away from its dark past of fascism, and which also would sort of contrast Europe to, so-called Soviet totalitarianism or Stalinism that, of course, existed at that time. The integration within Europe weakened after the 1970s, and in that period, which is, of course, the period of neoliberalism globally, the European project became a way of facilitating the neoliberal restructuring of European countries, many of which had sort of tried to build a kind of welfare state model of capitalism, and that was supposed to be an alternative and a more humane alternative to more free market types of capitalism as in the US. So when we look at Europe today, we see that this moment of prosperity, democracy, transcendence of fascism. In retrospect, it seems to have been just a moment, and this moment in the so-called in a period that many scholars have called the golden age of regulated capitalism, that this moment was more of a function of the particular model of the capitalist development that prevailed in that period, rather than a function of the European Union per se. And what we've seen is, with the neoliberal restructuring, is that as this model of Keynesian welfare states has declined, this has led to a sort of weakening of democracy in general, because what this has brought is a kind of a sense that democratically elected governments can no longer sort of tame capitalist markets. And this has sort of bred a certain level of apathy and cynicism among people. So with the crisis, of course, the recent crisis, things have taken an even darker turn. So while before, the current crisis, the crisis of democracy, was more like a crisis of apathy, a kind of sense that, that basically governments did the bidding of capital. Today, we actually have a crisis of democracy that takes a sort of that goes beyond the sort of rule of neoliberal technocrats to actually taking a form that is even more overtly authoritarian. So we see this authoritarianism, of course, especially in the countries like Greece that have adopted the most sort of brutal forms of austerity. So as these brutal forms of austerity that destroy people's living conditions and democratic and labor rights take their toll, people, of course, try to resist, and in order to push these austerity policies, many of these democratic rights are repealed, and the state apparatus is used in increasingly authoritarian ways. So basically what we've seen is, like with the present crisis, a kind of a brutal class war has resulted that helps to weaken democracy even further. It is, in this context, it's not surprising to see the comeback of fascism in countries like Greece, Hungary, Ukraine, the Ukraine, and others. Now, this fascism, of course, the presence of fascism in the different countries is partly the result of national specificities and political traditions and so on, but of course it's also partly a product of economic crisis and desperation in many parts of the world, a delegitimation of political elites that are sort of that have distinguished themselves for their corruption and for their servility to capital, and it is also fed by a sense of national humiliation when citizens see that increasingly decisions seem to be made in Berlin and then they're administered by Brussels. So, having been one of the early victims of the current European crisis, as well as the paradigmatic case of the destructiveness of austerity, Greece is, as good a microcosm of studying these processes I'm talking about as any. So the beginning of the crisis in Greece was a shock that took many people by surprise. And as the crisis proceeded, the whole narrative about Europe was turned upside down. So before the crisis, the whole idea, the whole mystique about Europe in Greece was, that being part of the Eurozone in Europe, basically Greece was going to converge upwards towards the standards of living of Germany and the other richer countries in the north. Since the crisis, the narrative is the complete opposite. So the narrative now is that in order to stay in the Eurozone, Greece has to reduce all the labor rights and standards of living and so on and so forth to the lowest common denominator, that of countries like Bulgaria and Romania. Similarly, the early appeal of Europe for Greece was that by becoming part of Europe, where there was a more established and normal form of capitalist democracy, that Greece was going to move away from its dark past of basically successive fascist dictatorships and concentration camps for the followers of the left. Now, again, we have a reversal where basically in order to stay in the Eurozone and continue getting the loans from the IMF and the European Union that will allow Greece to stay in the Eurozone, basically people's basic democratic rights and labor rights have to be completely dismantled. So in this context, you can understand why there is a growing sense of anger, a growing sense of Euroscepticism, and also this anger, of course, is directed against political elites that basically say we need to do all these things in order to supposedly achieve economic recovery. Of course, economic recovery is nowhere to be seen in Greece. So, the economy has shrunk by 25% in the last few years. Unemployment is 30%. Unemployment for young people is around 60%. Now, as you can imagine, this sort of social catastrophe has had, very serious repercussions for the political landscape in Greece. It's like a political earthquake. The two parties that had long dominated Greek politics for 40 years, the equivalent of the Democrats and the Republicans, have seen their support collapse. They used to get like 80% of the vote. Now they, in the most recent polls, if you add up one of them, the socialists who started implementing the project, have almost disappeared. So if there were elections, people are saying they might not make it into the parliament. And so they poll around 5% or less, and the conservatives poll around 20%. So basically what you have as a result of the crisis is a political polarization between the anti-austerity left, which is leading in the polls, and the fascist right. So basically what you have here is a struggle between different narratives. The narrative of the left is the narrative that traces the crisis to the irrationalities and injustices of neoliberal capitalism, as opposed to the fascist right that tries to scapegoat immigrants and rails against corrupt and treacherous politicians. So you have, this is also a struggle between a project to enhance democratic rights and labor rights, and the project of physically assaulting immigrants, LGBT people, labor unions, anti-fascist activists, while also defending, of course, the interests of bankers, ship owners, and so on. And it's basically also a struggle between an effort to go beyond neoliberal capitalism and an effort on the part of the right to sort of use, sort of anti-systemic posturing and rhetoric in order to really pursue a project that will be consistent with the interests of neoliberalism's main polarization. So Greece, in many ways, is perhaps the most extreme case of the effects of austerity, but it's also a reminder of a truth that transcends its borders. And that truth, of course, is that the guarantee for that the key to democracy and peace and prosperity and the end of fascism is not the European Union or any other kind of international organization that tries to regulate and administer capitalism. The key to achieving these goals, to achieving meaningful political democracy, prosperity, and peace, is basically a democratized economy that would allow all people to have equal say over the social, economic, and political institutions that shape their lives.